ora, and welcome to the Marlborough Book Festival podcast, the place where you can hear writers talk about their work, their lives, and the inspiration behind their writing. I'm Sonia, the chair of the committee. This year's festival was a fantastic weekend, and we are eager to share the recordings with you very soon. In the meantime, enjoy this engaging session from the 2023 Book Festival.
Kia ora koutou, no mai hara mai I tēnei pō. He mihi nui ki a Dr. Peter Meihana. He mihi nui ki a Jane, me Astrolabe Wines. So welcome everyone to this session of the Marlborough Book Festival. First things first, I did want to welcome Dr. Peter Meihana. He is why we are all here tonight. But following that lovely mihi to Peter from Jane, I do want to acknowledge that. And also thank, of course, Astrolabe Wines who have sponsored this session. Before we start, just a few housekeeping, otherwise I will forget that. So please do take note of where the exits are. There's one here and one over there. And please do turn your phones off now if they haven't already been turned off. In the event of an earthquake, out of your seats, drop, cover and hold. At the end, there will be time for questions. There will be roving microphones, so if you do have a question, can you please just wait until you are in receipt of a microphone so that your question can be heard for the podcast. And finally, and I'll remind you towards the end as well, there is an opportunity to buy Peter's book at the end in the foyer, and he will be there signing it for you. So, now if we turn to Pete, welcome. And for those of you that don't know, Peter is a senior lecturer of Māori history at Massey University. He has published numerous articles and chapters on Māori privilege, or the idea of Māori privilege, as well as on the history and traditions of Māori in Te Tauihu, or Te Waka a Maui, which is here, top of the South Island. He is a current trustee for Rangitani. He was a former trustee for Ngāti Kuia, and he remains involved with Ngāti Apa ki te rā tō. So, Pete, welcome. And before we get into the book, I do just want to touch on the background to it and your interest in this idea of Māori privilege. You've said that it was sparked in 1995 with the publication of Stuart Scott's Travesty of the Treaty. And that's nearly 30 years ago. So what has held your interest in the subject for almost 3 decades?
Tuatahi, ko tētahi au o ngā aho I te kaitaka ki o whātonga, nō reira, he mihi ana ki a koe e koe mo te kōrero, whakahaere I tēnei pō. Ka huri au ki tō tātou nei kaumātua kuia, ka hara mai I tēnei pō, ke te hāpai te kaupapa o te pō nei mihi ana ki a koutou. I just want to welcome everybody as well. I'm really humbled that so many people have turned up, and a little bit nervous, but also with all these lights here, I'm not going to go away with a tan. But it's very hot. So with all that, with the formalities aside, I suppose my interest in the subject, it goes back to that book, Travesty of the Treaty. At the time I was an undergraduate student at university. But I think more generally, I've always had an interest in history and whakapapa, oral traditions, and those kinds of things. And I think growing up and being around kaumātua and kuia, who when I spoke to those kaumātua and kuia, it was really interesting. It's an interesting phenomenon that when you speak to these people, they often talked about kaumātua and queer, who when I did the maths, my kaumātua and queer weren't even alive at the time, the people they were talking about, but they had been given oral traditions and histories from their parents passed on to them, and so those stories kind of fascinated me. But I also had some history teachers at Marlborough Boys College who I still fondly remember. One of those teachers was a man by the name of John Davies, and I remember he was one of the few brown faces on staff at Marlborough Boys College at that time. We had the Māori teacher and we had Mr. Davies. And I remember, funny story, sitting in history class one day and Ron and Margie Crosby are here, and their son Matt was a very good friend of mine, and we always sat together during history class, and Matt, as Margie and Ron will know, is very good at egging people on to ask questions, but kind of then sits back and has a chuckle. And he asked me to ask Mr. Davies where he came from, and what we really wanted to know was, was he Māori or was he Pacific Islander or whatever? And in the end, Matt got impatient and said to Mr. Davies, "You don't get a tan like that by just coming from Picton." And so he disclosed his whakapapa and said he's Sikh, and he really was, in terms of my history journey, was really important. And what he did one day was he asked me where I was from, and at that time I was kind of on my own journey finding out who I was. And as children, we used to spend a lot of time in Kaikoura at our marae, our mother's marae at Mangamonu, and of course from living in Waido, there's a few families you sort of can't live in this area and not know them. So we always grew up knowing the McDonalds were cousins. So we knew we had rangitani links, and an uncle of mine, Uncle Jim Walker, who was very close to us, we used to spend time with him and out at Canvastown. So we knew that we were Ngaitahu from Kaikoura, rangitani from here, and Ngāti Queer out in the valley. And Mr. Davies then went out to the back of the classroom and pulled out a box, and it was full with all of these old government papers and letters that our ancestors had written to the Parliament. And at the very, very top of the pile, there was a census, and it was entitled "Landless Natives of Marlborough." And because I was kind of getting into whakapapa at the time, I recognised all of those names. I recognised people like Meihana Kiriopa, Te Oti MacDonald, Jane Smith, my great-grandmother. And so, it's quite a powerful thing to see your ancestors' names written on these documents that's 100 years old, and that really hooked me into history. And so that was around 1990. And another important or an interesting event for me was 1990 was the anniversary of the signing of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, and of course we signed out here in the Bay 17 June 1840. And back then history was kind of a little bit odd, but people were into reenactments. And so when the Historic Society came to the college and said, "Listen, we're going to do a reenactment of the signing out at Port Underwood," and I thought, yeah, I'll go along. And so we all jumped into a minivan, went out there on the day, and the Historic Society was there, and I thought I would get a role as a native. Well, I didn't. But the role I did get was a whaler, and his name was Joseph Toms. And unbeknown to me at the time, And a year or so later, I talked to my Uncle Jim Walker about the day, and it just so happened that the person I played on that day was Joseph Toms, and he happened to be my fourth great-grandfather. And he married a woman called Te Ua, and Te Ua's father was a man by the name of Nuhurua, who was Te Rauparaha's older brother. And so that kind of put me on another kind of journey to find out about that part of my whakapapa. Uncle Jim it was very hard to coax anything out of Uncle Jim, particularly talking about that side of our whakapapa, but I managed to. And Nuhurua is known because he refused to sign Te Tiriti o Waitangi until his Pākehā son-in-law signed the treaty, because if his descendants lost their land, they wouldn't just blame him, they would blame their Pākehā ancestor as well. So yeah, all of these events kind of fed into my interest in history more broadly. And obviously going to university was a moment as well. So living in Blenheim, growing up in Blenheim, we didn't really have, my time at least, there wasn't much diversity in Blenheim. You went to the college, there was a handful of Māori boys, most of them relations, very few, one Pacifica, and two brothers whose parents owned the Night and Day down Main Street. So that was diversity in Blenheim. But going to university, there was obviously a whole range of other people, and it was really it opened my eyes. But it was also good in that there were many other Māori people there, and you got to meet Māori from across the country and learn about their experiences as well. Being at university also exposed me to theories and concepts and new literature. So at the time I was there was a book called Ka Whawhai Tonu Mātou, written by Ranginui Walker, and it was written and published to coincide with the 1990 commemorations. And there was two other books which I devoured, and one of those was Claudia Orange's Treaty of Waitangi and James Ballach's the New Zealand Wars. And so they were useful for me because they kind of created an order in my mind about history. And probably another person who was influential in shaping the way I thought was Moana Jackson. And we were fortunate at that time in that we had student unions. Mm-hmm. And so what happened with Te Rōpū Māori, we were able to, if you indicated that you were Māori, a portion of your student fee would go to Te Rōpū Māori, and we'd use the fees to bring people down to Dunedin, and they would come down and they'd do talks, and then they'd spend time with us. So we were really lucky in that we had people like Moana Jackson, Tamiiti came down, Honi Harawira, Annette Sykes, all of these people.
So these Māori academics and these Māori leaders coming down. Yeah, we were really, really fortunate. That doesn't happen so much anymore at university. But so all of these things kind of fed into my understanding of New Zealand. The other thing too, which was happening in the early 1990s, if people remember back that far, we had the second fisheries settlement, the fiscal envelope. We had, people will remember, the occupation of Pākaitori up in Whanganui. We had Mike Smith cutting down the tree
up at Maungakeke in Auckland, and at the time I was living with 7 people in our dreary flat. 5 of them were from Auckland, and so they were kind of a little bit distraught about that. I couldn't understand it really. It was a pine tree. So these things were happening at that time as well. When I came back to Te Tauihu, iwi were starting to gear up for claims and settlements. The other thing that was happening at that time was the beginning of the foreshore and seabed claim. And because I had finished university and Kaumātua and Queer at that time thought, well, you should be involved in some of this. And so...
so this is the early 2000s?
This was the late 90s.
Late 90s, okay.
Yeah. And we were part of the beginning of the foreshore and seabed claim. We had court hearings in front of the Environment Court, just over here at what was the Sun Country Lodge, I think it was. And it was great because we'd all turn up at Te Hora Marae, and our lawyer would be there, and we'd have to practice our lines. And so people who were selected to present evidence, you'd turn up and you'd have your lines, and those hearings, the information that was gathered during the Environment Court hearings was then used to lodge our claim in the Māori Land Court that began the foreshore and seabed claim. A few years on from that, we had the Te Tauihu Waitangi Tribunal hearings, and that was, for my age group, that was almost a renaissance. We in a way we had to relearn and relive our past, and so we were researching, going through Māori Land Court minute books, reading other people's research, and then we had to write our affidavits and that kind of thing. And it was it was really, really exciting, and and I was very much taken by the interaction between the lawyers and historians. And I went to the hearings. At the time, it was kind of good because I was unemployed, but so I took my son, and he and I travelled around to these hearings, and I thought, whoa, this is cool. I want some of this. And so after the hearings, I approached Massey University and said I want to do postgraduate study. And then I had to come up with a topic. And so the thing that was most fresh in my mind was the foreshore and seabed claim. So I think the name of the thesis was From Anakoha to New York, the genesis of the foreshore and seabed claim and the marginalisation of Ngāti Queer. And so that was kind of my start. And one of the things that came out after the Court of Appeal came out with its decision was that there was a kickback from the public, and these ideas of Māori privilege started to be regenerated, and people like Don Brash and the Orewa speech kind of was a flashpoint. And so I thought I'd love to do an extended study, so that became the focus of the PhD, and so that's how I it's very long-winded, but that's how I arrived.
No, it's fascinating.
Yeah, that's how I arrived at the topic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so this book, Privilege and Perpetuity, Exploding a Pākehā Myth, this is following on from the work that you did for your PhD.
Yeah.
And if we turn to the book, I do just want to start with an extract from a newspaper that you've got in here. The extract is, "This is no time for favouritism of one class of the inhabitants of the colony, least of all inexpensive favouritism." And that extract is sort of that's a reflection of the belief that Māori are being or are going to be privileged at the expense of Pākehā. And when I was reading that extract, I thought, well, that's something I could have read on social media last week. But that's actually almost 200 years old. And that's really what this book is about. These conversations that Māori are being privileged, Māori are receiving benefits and being prioritised over Pākehā, these aren't new. These are things that have been happening since Europeans arrived here. And I just thought that was quite ridiculous, if I'm being honest. So talking about privilege, you differentiate between two things. So you differentiate between the official manifestations of that privilege and the populist identification of that privilege. And we're talking about 200 years ago. So if you could just perhaps explain those a bit.
Yeah. So when I started researching the topic, when you do a PhD, and I should kind of say, this PhD in many ways is not a Māori PhD. It's a kind of a standard PhD. If it was a Māori PhD, it would be structured around whakapapa and those kind of things. So this PhD is kind of a pretty kind of standard exercise. And what I wanted to do was look to see when the discourse of Māori privilege began and how it developed and evolved over time. And so that particular quote you read out, that was a quote that was published in the Nelson Examiner. So the Nelson Examiner was a newspaper that was part of kind of the Nelson settlement and run by the company settlers. Yeah, and that particular quote is in reference to the Protectorate Department, and so the Protectorate Department, it was tasked with being present when land transactions take place to make sure that Māori weren't being, inadvertently ripped off. And so the company saw the Protectorate as an obstacle in acquiring Māori land. And because it was an obstacle in acquiring Māori land, the company settlers saw it as privileging Māori. Yeah, and so, and when you read these newspapers, the things that flash in your mind is, well, that particular quote, you can see that presently in some people, in the statements that people make about the Waitangi Tribunal, for instance. Cut it. It's no good. It's obviously favours Māori. Need to get rid of it. Te Puni Kōkiri, you see those sort of statements made in relation to Te Puni Kōkiri. And so many of those kinds of statements and expressions have been just taken and reapplied in the present. But we'll come back to that in a minute. But one thing I wanted to do too was understand, okay, where is the origin of this idea? And I kind of started in 1769 when James Cook arrived. And what you see at that point is almost an intellectual privileging of Māori. And what I mean by that is, when James Cook came into the Pacific, he was making observations about those indigenous peoples that he observed, and those observations weren't objective, because he came here already with a framework very much in his mind, and that framework determined how he classified and categorised people. So when Cook arrives, the ideas that were prevalent at the time were the ideas of the Scottish Enlightenment. I don't want this to sound like a lecture, but I find it interesting. The Scottish Enlightenment, the thinkers of the Scottish Enlightenment, they applied the ideas of the general Enlightenment to societies and cultures. And what they said was, you can understand a culture and a society through their means of subsistence. So if a people are hunter-gatherers, they are here at this end of the continuum, and the continuum goes in a line like this, and at the very top obviously are going to be the people who are doing the classifying. And so those people were the British, and of course the British at that time were industrialising. So people progressed from hunter-gatherer societies through to industrial societies, and in the middle could be placed every culture and every society. So when Cook comes here, of course he travels around, he observes what's going on in the North Island, and then he comes into the South Island, and of course he spends 171 days in Queen Charlotte Sound with yours and my cousin relations, ancestors, and he makes some comments that are really reflective of the thinking of the Scottish Enlightenment, and he says the people in Queen Charlotte Sound live on fish and fern root, and their practices are in a way substandard to what he's already seen in the North Island. And here he's making comments on things like carving and those kinds of things. So he didn't see any carving here on waka and things like that. Whereas in the North Island there were elaborate examples. So even between areas in Aotearoa, he was classifying people. So in the north, obviously people were cultivating kumara, and so cultivation was a characteristic of a more advanced people.
It's the greatest step on this little sliding scale.
Yeah. So by the time Cook leaves the Pacific, he has already classified and categorised the people that he's met. So you have the wretches of Terra del Fuego, the people at the bottom of of South America, Aboriginals, they are all down here. People like Polynesians, but the Polynesians too were also classified. And in Cook's mind, the Tahitians were the most advanced, and also because in Cook's mind they were the most beautiful. And if you read the observations of people from Johann Forster, who was the ethnographer on the second journey, he talks about Māori, and we apparently had knobbly knees, treated our women poorly, tattooing, all those kinds of things. So we were, whilst we were savage, we were at least a little bit better than all of those other peoples below us. And so
we were amenable to civilization. Well, we were able to be civilized in their minds.
Yes, because everybody had the potential to become civilized, but the catch was you needed somebody to teach you how to be civilized. So fast forward into the 19th century, and you had debates going on in Britain, and you had debates among people like the humanitarians and what the historians have in the past called colonial reformers, and they had debates over how to treat indigenous peoples. And so in 1837 there was a really important report, an inquiry that was undertaken, and even though New Zealand at that time wasn't a colony, the 1837 report on the Aborigines basically became the policy statement that was used when Aotearoa was annexed. And so the arguments the arguments that kind of took place were Māori are a particular type of savage. They've got the potential to advance, and therefore they needed to be protected. And then the question is, well, who do they need to be protected from? And in the lead up to 1840, the people who the Colonial Office thought were the most were going to inflict the most danger on Māori was the New Zealand Company and other land speculators. So protecting Māori meant protecting Māori from the speculators, but protecting Māori also meant making sure that that Māori were going to receive the benefits of British civilization, that they would receive the rights and privileges of British subjects, i.e. the protection of English law. Yeah, and people kind of think that our treaty was somehow different to other treaties, and in some ways it was. It had a Te Reo Māori version, but Article 3 is really important in Māori privilege discourse, because it says Māori will receive Her Majesty's royal protection and the rights and privileges of British subjects. And it's those two ideas that play out post-1840 and which ultimately lead to the dispossession of Māori. Yeah.
And that's one of the saddest things I think about this book, is that you're identifying how the governors and the official policy is saying, oh, we're going to make sure that Māori are protected. This is our policy, and their view as well. You know, they've been very privileged. We've been very nice to them. At the same time that we're taking their land and saying we're the only ones that you can sell to. And then you've got the settlers on the other side saying, oh, well, they are far more privileged and this is just not fair, this is not right. I just want to take their land too. And at the end of it, there are Māori there with no land. And that's really where it gets to. And that's what your book is, sort of drives at. There's this idea that there is the privilege of protection, there is the privilege of having private property, having land in European freehold title. There is the privilege of having citizenship. You've got all the rights and privileges of being a British citizen, but the end result is still the same. Māori were marginalised, and Māori did not have land. It was taken from them. It was dispossessed of them. And one of the quotes in your book I just thought really sums that up in one sentence, and that is that colonisation was infused with the idea of Māori privilege. The idea that Māori should be grateful for the things they're getting. The British Empire and its generosity is extending to Māori all the rights and privileges that it hasn't extended to other people, other Indigenous people, and the settlers' view that Māori are having this unfair privilege because they can only sell to the Crown, and then the Crown's going to sell to the settlers at a stupidly inflated price, and this is just unfair all around. And yet nobody's really sort of looking at how it impacts on Māori itself. And you've referred to in your book some of the politicians of the time and their discussions around how that can be affected. How this can move from ownership to leasehold, or vice versa, and the ideas that leasehold is good. It can sustain Māori, and then that pushback from settlers and others that no, it needs to be ownership. You can't have landlords in New Zealand. That's just not how we do things.
Yep. So there's some clear patterns across the 19th century. So from 1840 to 1852, for the most part, the Crown was the primary purchaser of Māori land. Yep. And that was deemed as protecting and privileging Māori. But if we have a look, for instance, what happened in this region, when following the Wairau Fray out here in 1843, there was a Te Rauparaha places a rāhui on the area because people had died. Then settlers were looking to come back, George Grey was instructed to somehow get a hold of the Wairau and make that land available to Pākehā settlers. His plan was to use the idea of preemption, i.e. the Crown is the only purchaser. So he was quite a cunning man, and so what he did was he kidnapped Te Rauparaha, took Te Rauparaha up to Auckland and kept him up there for 18 months. In the meantime, he goes to Wellington and he gets the three chiefs, Te Meihana, Te Rauparaha, Mātini Te Whiwhi and Rawiri Puaha, and he says to them, I want to buy your land in the Wairau. And because, of course, they want their uncle and father back, they agree. But then what Grey does, he goes down to Ngaitahu and says to Ngaitahu, and keeping in mind that Ngāti Toa and Ngaitahu had previously been at war, and he says to Ngaitahu, we want to buy your land. And Ngaitahu says, well, here's the price. But of course, the company and the Crown had already decided on what the price was going to be. And so in the end, they end up having to sell because Grey says, well, it doesn't matter because Ngāti Toa's already sold your land. And so Ngaitahu are forced into selling their land. And then Crown agents come into the top of the south and play the same tricks.
The playoffs against... Yeah.
They play tribes off against each other. And in the end, much of the South Island is being dispossessed, and it's all been done through the deploying of Crown preemption, which was supposed to protect Māori. And then you come into the late 1850s, and people are now arguing that, well, actually, Māori need the same rights and privileges of British subjects because that's what we promised. That's what we promised Māori. And so, in 1862, Crown preemption is abolished, and the Native Land Court is instituted. And the idea is that Māori should have a title like every other British citizen. And the thinking behind it all was that if Māori were given a title that recognisable in English law, they would become good brown-skinned Protestant farmers. But the problem was Māori weren't given all of those other benefits of being able to develop the land either. So you saw a policy switch, and the policy switch was always predicated or argued on the notion that Māori were being privileged via protection, but at the same time they needed to be given the rights and privileges of British subjects. And as you say, it didn't matter what policy was in, Māori lost land. And so by the time you get to the end of the 19th century, much Māori land had been lost. And so there's a really interesting, I think, and it shows probably just how powerful the notion of Māori privilege was at the end of the 19th century, was when the government passed this thing called the Native Lands, the Settlement Act and Māori Lands Administration Act. And Māori had actually been involved. We had been talking to the Crown, our Māori politicians, kind of said, okay, this is not actually what we want, but it's the best we can get. And so when that Act was passed, there was a provision in that Act that would allow Māori to lease land to Pākehā settlers, and therefore retain the freehold. But what you see in the first 4 years of the 20th century, you saw a concerted campaign by the opposition in Parliament and the New Zealand Herald. And they made this argument against leasing. And the arguments they made were actually leasing's bad for Māori. Māori shouldn't be allowed to lease land because what they'll do is they'll get the rents from Pākehā and then they'll sit there, smoke tobacco and get fat. I know this is actually so you saw that this was written into in the colonial press. You saw that you can see these in cartoons, and so this concerted effort both within the house and outside the house saw gradually the legislation amended over time so that none of those leasing provisions by the end of the decade were intact. And so for the next 10 years after 1909, Māori continued to lose land. So you can actually kind of graph it. So when you can kind of see where there is a peak in claims and assertions of Māori privilege, you'll see Māori lose land. Yeah, and so by the end of the 19th century, Māori had very little land left. Māori in the South Island, we were literally landless natives.
Which is a problem, in terms of you don't have land. But the bigger problem that arises from that as well is that you needed to own land in that European freehold title style in order to participate or stand in local government and things like that. So it's not only that you've lost your land, but the rights and privileges you have as a citizen to participate in government are also taken from you because you don't have land.
Yeah, and so what the government believed that Māori would take up fee simple title quickly, and because the court became quite clogged up, it took a long time for Māori to gain fee simple title. So of course in 1867 it passes the Māori Representation Act, and so Māori are given the franchise. And I know, it's election year, so you will always see, the idea of the Māori seats. Should we do away with them? All those kinds of things, and they're kind of deemed as a privilege. But if you actually go back to the debates within the House, it wasn't really a thing of goodwill. Well, there was in a way because, you had the wars of the 60s were still kind of ticking on. You had kupapa tribes who had fought with the Crown, and so some people argued that those tribes, why shouldn't they, get seats in Parliament? But there were other things in the background as well. Trying to keep electoral balance between the North Island and the South Island, because of course you had a whole heap of gold miners coming into the South Island, and they were entitled to the vote as well. So the 4 Māori seats have to be seen in that context too. And even 4 Māori seats meant nothing. The Māori population at that time, which was about 56,000, Māori were probably entitled to 20 odd seats, but that would be too much of a threat to the settler Parliament. Yeah. And of course, election time, you see the seats come under attack. That's always been the case. In the 50s, the national government were trying to get rid of the seats because kind of keeping them out of power. So there was a move to try to get rid of the seats then. So they always become political footballs for
And just following on from that, and I am conscious of the time, so I will turn to asking questions from the audience soon, but just following on from those seats and those concepts again, that should we do away with them, why are we privileging Māori? It's the idea that Māori are privileged that's enduring, and again, coming back to your book, you've said many New Zealanders hold firm to the belief that Māori have been treated better than other Indigenous peoples, and moreover that they're currently receiving benefits that other New Zealanders do not. And you've referred to David Round, who's a Canterbury law lecturer, who's argued that Māori should consider themselves fortunate to have been colonised by the British, because the British were humane and generous. And you've also referred to John Ansell, who's probably better known for being a former ACT marketing director, who's called for a colourblind state, which would be of benefit to everyone, including Māori, who would be forced to stand on their own 2 feet like other New Zealanders, and would probably be pleasantly surprised at what they are able to achieve once they take personal responsibility for their own lives. So this idea that Māori are privileged has endured across nearly 200 years. And I'm just wondering, why do you think that, your book clearly shows that these ideas are wrong. Why do you think it's enduring?
There's a whole lot of things in there. The idea that Māori were, the idea that somehow British colonisation is more benevolent than other forms of colonisation, well, the problem with that is that's even colonising in itself, because what it's implying is that there is that you can even classify people's oppression and dispossession. Yet the experiences for Māori have been, it's been traumatic. We know all these things. We know that my grandparents died at 67, and Māori continue to fall behind in those kinds of stats. So, but I think too that classifying people's oppression is saying more about the classifier than it is about the classified, because it's saying that somehow we, the coloniser, are better than others, and it feeds into, I think, our sense of identity, that somehow we were better. But the reason I think it endures. The reason I think it endures is because there's a bit of nostalgia here, right? Because I think it's starting to wane, but I think people see Māori over the last 30 years have made tremendous developments and gains, and Māori have become, will no longer sit back and take a back seat to take a back seat. It's our country as well, and so whenever Māori stand up and say this is us, it generates a response in some people that I think they think is taking away from them, and that's not how we see it. It's not a finite cake.
No.
Yeah. And so many of the ideas of Māori privilege that we can identify in the 19th century, you can literally, those tropes you can take from the 19th century and place them into the 21st century, which people like anti-treatists have. But of course, initially Māori privilege was a way in which Māori could be dispossessed of their land. Well, the land's gone. So why is it that these ideas of Māori privilege persist. And partly too, it's because it's a way of constraining Māori aspirations. Yeah, and they like to pull on the heartstrings. It's, we're Kiwis, we don't do, privilege is not part of who we are. Yeah.
Doesn't change the fact that Māori has still been marginalised, though, does it? Okay, we've got about 10 minutes. Are there any questions? I'm sure there are plenty of questions. There are microphones, I believe, going to be floating around. So if you have a question, please put your hand up and wait for the microphone. Questions? There's one over here, please.
I don't know if I'll need one.
Oh, it's just for the podcast. So.
Oh no! I'm not going to be on a podcast, am I? I don't know, I just find every now and then if I come across, maybe I'll just call them a racist, and they, have this Māori privilege thing coming out of their mouth, and I try to argue with them, and then I find it hard to argue with them, so I end up coming back to UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People. And just lately I've found that actually seems to shut them up, because I say to them, well, this is actually a global phenomenon, like all Indigenous peoples have been marginalised, and this is now a global thing, and New Zealand is obligated to go into the, that declaration and the rights of Indigenous people. Is that something that you think should be more openly discussed, because I don't know that a lot of people know about it?
To me, what is important, and I've kind of got a little bit of hope with the new Aotearoa history curriculum. I always say this, people have heard me say this before, I'm a glass half full person. I think that sometimes you have to pick and choose your fights, and I think I think in some ways it's probably better to channel our energies into schools, where we should be, for one, teaching young people, critical thinking, being able to look at something and say, okay, this can be understood or contextualised in a particular way that we teach young people, say this is not good history, and this is good history, and so I think over time we might see some changes. You're not going to convince everybody. And sometimes it becomes quite draining having these arguments. I watch with interest the anti-co-governance tour that's going around the place, and I actually managed to, being white passing, slip into the first talk that Julian Batchelor did, and I listened in and I thought, bad history. But what I think has been good out of that is that you're actually getting people, Māori, Pākehā, non-Māori, together, and they're actually discussing things, they're discussing history. So there's a bit of a silver lining there. So do you continue arguing with people? Maybe send them the book.
Any other questions? One over here, please. Oh, and then there's one in the middle over there after that.
Kia ora, Pete.
Kazi.
We're very proud of you in the iwi here in the top of the south. Thank you for the writing that you've done. It's really contributed to people's understanding of these issues. I'm pretty sure about that. On a personal note, I do remember a few years ago you were at a crossroads. You couldn't decide, maybe history, maybe law. And I wondered if you thought that choosing the history side had enabled you to do the writing and the thinking that you were wanting to do, rather than, say, just being another lawyer.
So what happened there? I remember I got a little stint at the Waitangi Tribunal, and I thought that I would, while I was in Wellington, try law. I actually just failed. Yeah. And I thought, not for me. But I like the idea. Too late. I think my mind's starting to solidify now. Yeah.
And there was another question in the middle over here.
Thank you. Peter, are there any surveys available that give us an idea of how many of the population of New Zealand are arguing the Maori privilege argument and how many are not, and whether or not that's increasing or decreasing, or is there any hope on the horizon, or what? I mean, is it becoming more extreme or less extreme currently, do you think?
I think particularly with social media, it's becoming it's increasing. I suppose part of the research was going to different sites and different platforms to kind of understand what's going on. I suppose in my field, in the Māori privilege field, once you've seen one, you don't really have to read the rest, because there's a particular formula when it comes to people writing about Māori privilege. One is, it starts with Māori were savage barbarians who were killing each other, and then the British turned up, and then they saved the day, and then Māori didn't recognise how lucky they were, and that's why they fought against the government. And today, to borrow Julian Batchelor's words, the elite Māori are just not, they're not recognising the privileges of British colonisation. So there is, in terms of, they're called anti-treatyism is the easiest phrase to use, that you can sort of bring all of those texts together. And there's actually it's a growing genre of books now. So that sort of stuff is starting to increase. And I noticed too, on some platforms, people are actually quoting those texts, and it's like, well, do a little bit more research, but so I don't know whether it's. So was your question that is it getting worse or is it getting better?
And are there any surveys that give us an idea of how many people, percentage of the population might be putting onto the idea of Māori privilege?
I see ACT is up in the polls. Yeah, so that might be an indicator. Yeah.
We've probably got time for one more question. There's one at the front here, please.
Kia ora, Peter.
Kia ora.
I'd like to know a little bit about your collaboration with Astrolabe and what you're proposing to do on the railway side over here, and what's the future looking there? Is this something to do with the...
Oh, I feel like giving it to my young cousin Will McDonald to answer that one.
Well, you can answer that.
I suppose, yeah, that's... So I suppose I'd have to put on my trustee hat now for Rangitani. As the oldest and longest occupants of the rohe, we want to be part of the community. And so we're constantly looking for partnerships and relationships and those kind of things. And you know, we often have little tussles with, for instance, the district council, but they're our friends. So, yeah, I mean, we had a really good result the other day with the naming of the new library and that sort of precinct there. We see that as positive. Some people might see it as Māori privilege. But for us, it's a gift to the community. Yeah. I think the community's privileged to have that name.
Everyone join me in a hand for Peter.
Pardon me?
Sorry, did you have one last question? Sorry, just one more.
Kia ora koutou katoa. My name is Lawrence McDonald. Kia ora, Peter.
Kia ora, Uncle.
Kia ora.
Kia ora.
We're talking about Māori privilege. Now, my father and my mother worked hard to put us through college. And there's a lot of Māori people out there who suffered the same ordeal like Pākehā people, working hard, working industriously to get their children educated in this modern world. So Māori privilege is a far-fetched idea by some academics who, like Peter says, don't want to get rid of history. And as far as I'm concerned, Māori, through their own efforts, I've got a nephew who is going to be the assistant coach for the All Blacks. I've had uncles who have gone overseas, played professional league. I had an uncle who was a gold medalist rower in the Olympics. He went to the Empire Games, and that's through their own industry, not as a privilege. We work hard for what we get. My grandfather, I've got Maori, Māori, Scottish and Italian history, whakapapa, and I'm very proud of those three races. And like I say, we work for what we get. And people have got to realise that. Thank you, Peter.
Kia ora.
Kia ora. So I just want to remind everybody that Peter's book can be purchased out in the foyer and that Peter will be available for signing it. And if we could all just give him another round of applause. Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Pretty
That was another great conversation from the 2023 Marlborough Book Festival. For more information about the event, head to marlboroughbookfest.co.nz. Thank you for listening. Stay tuned for more episodes soon.